The operating room erupted before anyone had time to realize how close disaster already stood. The shrill alarm of the cardiac monitor cut through the steady rhythm of surgical instruments, while gloved hands moved faster beneath the brilliant white lights that erased every shadow from the room. At the center of it all stood Dr. Adrian Mercer, the hospital's most celebrated trauma surgeon, his reputation built on impossible saves and unwavering confidence. Across the operating table, senior nurse Claire Donovan watched a different crisis unfolding, one that had not yet appeared on any monitor but was becoming unmistakably clear to her practiced eyes. She noticed the faint bluish tint creeping across the patient's fingertips despite acceptable oxygen readings. She saw the anesthesiologist glance twice at the blood pressure before quietly adjusting medication. She caught the smallest hesitation in the heartbeat tracing that everyone else dismissed as interference. Years had taught her that patients often whispered their emergencies long before they screamed them. She leaned slightly toward the surgeon, careful not to interrupt the delicate repair he was completing. Her voice remained calm despite the urgency pressing against every instinct she possessed. "Doctor, something isn't matching the numbers. I think we're missing something." Dr. Mercer never looked up. His attention stayed fixed inside the open chest cavity, where every second mattered. "The procedure is under control, Claire. Trust the monitors." Around the room no one spoke. Everyone knew the reputation of the lead surgeon. His brilliance was matched only by his certainty, and few people ever questioned him twice. Claire stepped back exactly as protocol demanded, but her eyes never left the patient. The emergency had begun 42 minutes earlier when paramedics rushed in a middle-aged school principal named Daniel Brooks after a devastating highway collision. Broken ribs, internal bleeding, collapsed lung. The injuries were severe but straightforward for a trauma team with Mercer leading the operation. Yet from the moment Daniel entered the operating room, something had unsettled Claire. It was not panic. Panic clouded judgment. This feeling came from memory, sharpened by thousands of hours beside operating tables, where tiny inconsistencies often carried life-changing consequences. Before anesthesia, while helping prepare the patient, she had noticed an old medical bracelet tucked beneath his sleeve. Most staff ignored such things during emergencies, but Claire always looked. The bracelet listed a rare autoimmune blood disorder. She quietly informed the intake nurse, who entered it into the chart. Whether anyone had actually read it afterward, she did not know. Now, watching the patient's color slowly fade despite textbook treatment, that forgotten bracelet returned to her thoughts with unsettling clarity. A circulating nurse announced another blood pressure reading. Lower again. Dr. Mercer requested additional transfusions without hesitation. Suction, clamp, retractor. His commands came with practiced confidence, and every assistant obeyed instantly. The room functioned like a perfectly rehearsed orchestra. Yet Claire noticed something the orchestra itself could not hear. The blood filling the suction canister looked thinner than expected. The bleeding pattern did not fit the injury. She studied the laboratory screen mounted near anesthesia. One value blinked quietly in the corner, buried beneath more dramatic numbers. Coagulation time. Slightly prolonged. Not enough to trigger an alarm. Enough to trouble someone who understood what tiny changes could become inside an operating room. She approached again, this time more carefully. "Doctor," the coagulation result combined with his bracelet. Could this be an autoimmune reaction instead of uncontrolled hemorrhage? Several heads lifted. Even the surgical resident paused for half a heartbeat before passing another instrument. Dr. Mercer finally looked up, his eyes narrowing behind the protective shield. "Claire, we've already identified the bleeding source. Please let me do my job." His words were not shouted. They did not need to be. The quiet disappointment in his tone carried farther than anger would have. Heat spread across Claire's face beneath her mask. She had spent 23 years inside operating rooms, had helped save more lives than she could count, and had trained half the nurses standing beside her. Yet in that moment she became simply the nurse who had interrupted the surgeon. She nodded once and returned to her position without another word. The resident avoided meeting her eyes. The younger nurses lowered theirs. Hierarchies inside hospitals rarely needed explaining. Outside the operating room, Daniel's wife sat alone in the waiting area, clutching a folded letter her husband had planned to deliver at their daughter's graduation that weekend. She had read the first line a dozen times while waiting for updates, but could never continue because tears blurred every word beyond it. Across the hallway, their daughter paced silently beside a vending machine, still wearing her debate competition jacket, because no one had expected an ordinary drive home to end beneath flashing ambulance lights. Back inside surgery, minutes stretched longer than anyone admitted aloud. Dr. Mercer repaired another damaged vessel with remarkable precision. Technically, everything was improving. Blood loss slowed. Oxygen remained acceptable. Yet Claire could not silence the growing certainty pressing against her instincts. She remembered another operating room, nearly 12 years earlier. Different patient, different hospital, similar numbers, similar confidence, similar dismissal. That patient had died because everyone trusted the equipment more than the subtle story unfolding before their own eyes. Since that day, Claire had promised herself one thing. She would never ignore the quiet signs again, even if speaking cost her pride. She glanced once more at Daniel's hand where the medical bracelet rested beneath surgical tape. A tiny corner remained visible, enough to remind her why her concern refused to disappear. The anesthesiologist frowned while reviewing fresh blood gas results. "That's odd," he murmured almost to himself. Claire immediately turned toward him. Before either of them could speak further, the cardiac monitor emitted a different sound. Not louder, different. A rhythm every experienced clinician recognized instantly because it meant certainty had vanished. Heads turned simultaneously toward the screen. The heartbeat that had remained stable throughout the procedure suddenly staggered into an irregular pattern that none of the previous interventions explained. Dr. Mercer froze for the first time since the operation began. His confidence disappeared beneath a single expression no surgeon ever welcomed: confusion. Claire stepped forward without waiting for permission, her eyes already fixed on the forgotten bracelet as the room held its breath, because she knew that the next decision would determine whether Daniel Brooks ever opened his eyes again. The irregular rhythm spread across the monitor like a crack racing through glass, subtle for only a heartbeat, before every alarm in the operating room began demanding attention at once. Blood pressure continued to fall despite aggressive transfusions. The anesthesiologist called out the numbers with increasing urgency, while the scrub technician instinctively prepared additional instruments that no one had yet requested. Dr. Adrian Mercer stared into the surgical field, searching for the catastrophic bleed he expected to find, but the anatomy refused to match the crisis unfolding on the screens around him. Every instinct built over decades insisted that hidden hemorrhage remained the enemy, yet every new observation quietly argued otherwise. Claire Donovan took one measured step closer to the table. She had no interest in proving herself right. Pride had no place where a human life balanced between one heartbeat and the next. She only wanted the team to notice what the patient had been trying to tell them from the beginning. "Doctor, we're treating blood loss that may no longer be the primary problem," she said with remarkable calm. "The autoimmune disorder on his bracelet changes everything if it's been triggered by massive transfusion. We may be fighting the wrong battle." Mercer did not answer immediately. His hands continued working with disciplined precision. But Claire noticed something different now. The certainty had left his movements. For the first time that morning, he was thinking instead of commanding. Around the operating table, the staff exchanged uneasy glances without speaking. Hospitals were built on hierarchy because hesitation could kill, but they also depended on the courage of people willing to speak when something felt wrong. The circulating nurse hurried toward the electronic chart and enlarged the patient's medical history. Hidden beneath dozens of emergency entries sat the note Claire remembered seeing during preparation: rare autoimmune hemolytic disorder, previous transfusion complications, alert blood bank before emergency replacement. The words seemed almost impossible to miss now. Yet in the chaos of trauma, they had become just another line in an overcrowded record. The anesthesiologist looked up first. His expression changed before anyone else spoke. "Doctor, if she's right, these transfusions could be accelerating destruction instead of correcting it." Mercer finally raised his eyes toward the monitor, then toward the chart, then toward Claire. Before he could respond, another alarm pierced the room. Potassium climbing, heart rhythm worsening. Laboratory called with fresh results confirming rapid red blood cell breakdown. Every new piece of evidence aligned with the nurse's warning. Yet changing direction now meant admitting that precious minutes had been spent treating the wrong diagnosis. The weight of that realization settled over the operating room with almost physical force. Then, unexpectedly, everything became quiet. Not because the machines had stopped. They continued their relentless chorus. But the voices disappeared. No one reached for another instrument. No one announced another reading. For perhaps 3 seconds the only sound was the slow electronic pulse struggling across the monitor. It was the silence that exists only in places where everyone understands that the next decision may define the rest of their careers and someone else's entire future. Claire broke it gently. We still have time if we stop making his immune system fight itself. Contact a blood bank. Ask for specially matched units. Warm every infusion. Reduce unnecessary replacement. Check for hemolysis markers again. Her voice remained steady, almost impossibly so. She was not ordering anyone. She was offering the patient another chance. Mercer looked directly into her eyes. There was no challenge in her expression, no satisfaction, only concern. He glanced back at the exposed surgical field. The bleeding he had expected to worsen remained surprisingly controlled. The physiology finally made sense. The patient's own blood was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Mercer inhaled once, deeply enough that everyone nearby noticed. Then he spoke 4 words that transformed the atmosphere inside the operating room. Do what she said. Movement exploded back into the room with renewed purpose. The blood bank was contacted immediately. Pharmacy rushed specialized medication toward surgery. The anesthesiologist altered the transfusion strategy, while another nurse confirmed warming equipment. Claire coordinated each adjustment without raising her voice, anticipating needs before anyone requested them. Years of experience surfaced not through dramatic speeches, but through quiet efficiency. She checked medication dosages, verified laboratory timing, redirected communication between departments, and kept every member of the team focused on the same objective. Mercer returned his full attention to the surgical repair, but something fundamental had shifted. He asked Claire questions instead of dismissing her observations. She answered briefly, never wasting a word. Respect grew not because either of them demanded it, but because the patient required complete cooperation. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The heart rhythm stabilized slightly, then threatened to deteriorate again. Claire studied every monitor together instead of separately, searching for relationships rather than isolated numbers. She noticed one pressure reading lagging behind the others by only seconds. It reminded her of another detail she had almost forgotten from years earlier. She leaned closer to the anesthesiologist. Has anyone checked the central line placement since positioning changed? The anesthesiologist immediately verified it. The catheter had shifted just enough to compromise medication delivery. It was corrected within moments, and almost instantly several readings began responding more appropriately. Mercer looked up with unmistakable surprise. Another hidden problem uncovered before it became fatal. The younger resident watched Claire with open admiration now. Earlier he had seen only a nurse interrupting the surgeon. Now he was witnessing experience expressed through relentless observation. Knowledge inside an operating room was not measured only by titles. It was measured by the ability to recognize patterns, while everyone else saw only chaos. Fresh blood arrived from the bank, specially prepared according to the patient's rare condition. Treatment changed course completely. Hope returned cautiously, fragile as a candle in a storm. Then Mercer reached the damaged vessel he had been repairing since the beginning of the operation. As swelling eased under the new management, something previously hidden finally became visible beneath a fold of injured tissue. He paused. His eyes narrowed. Carefully he asked for suction. The field cleared. What emerged silenced everyone once again. A tiny fragment of shattered metal, no larger than the tip of a finger, had lodged deep beside the vessel, intermittently tearing it with every movement of the patient's heartbeat. It had remained concealed behind inflamed tissue, escaping every earlier inspection, while creating bleeding patterns that mimicked a far more common injury. Mercer slowly removed the fragment with delicate forceps and held it beneath the operating light. The room stared in disbelief. Claire realized at the same moment he did that the accident had never produced one problem. It had produced 2 separate crises unfolding simultaneously. each disguising the other so perfectly that solving only one would never have saved the man lying before them. And as the fragment dropped softly into the metal tray, everyone understood that the hardest part of the operation had only just begun. The tiny shard of twisted metal landed in the stainless steel tray with a faint metallic click, a sound so ordinary that no one outside the operating room would ever remember it. Yet inside those walls it marked the moment everything changed. Dr. Adrian Mercer studied the fragment for only a second before returning his full attention to the exposed vessel, but the certainty with which he had commanded the room earlier had been replaced by something far more valuable. He no longer viewed Claire Donovan as the nurse who had interrupted him. He now saw the colleague whose observations had prevented a fatal chain of mistakes. Around the operating table, every movement became more deliberate. The specialized blood products were finally circulating through Daniel Brooks's body, reducing the autoimmune destruction that had threatened to overwhelm every previous intervention. Yet the damage already done could not simply be erased. His organs had endured prolonged oxygen deprivation. His heart remained dangerously unstable. Even with the hidden metal fragment removed, survival was far from guaranteed. Claire glanced across the monitors one by one, refusing to focus on any single number for too long. Experience had taught her that patients rarely failed in only one place. The body whispered through patterns, not isolated alarms. She watched the arterial pressure begin a slow climb, while urine output remained almost non-existent. She noticed the heart rhythm becoming more organized, even as the blood chemistry lagged behind. Every change told part of the story. Every delay carried its own warning. The surgical resident stood frozen for a brief moment, uncertain which task deserved priority. Claire noticed before anyone else. She placed a fresh instrument into his waiting hand, without looking away from the patient. Prepare another vascular clamp. Warm saline. Notify intensive care that we're not finished yet. Her instructions were quiet enough that no panic spread through the room, yet precise enough that everyone immediately understood their role. The operating room no longer revolved around hierarchy. It revolved around purpose. Mercer requested another set of laboratory values. Claire already had them open before the request finished, leaving his mouth. Electrolytes stabilized. Hemoglobin improving slowly. Hemolysis markers declining for the first time since surgery began. The anesthesiologist allowed himself the smallest nod, though no one celebrated. They had seen too many patients appear to recover before slipping away during the final stretch. Hope inside an operating room had to remain disciplined. Outside those walls, Daniel's wife sat exactly where she had been for more than 2 hours, the folded graduation letter still resting between trembling hands. Hospital volunteers had offered coffee. Friends had called. Family members had arrived quietly and taken seats beside her. She thanked each of them with polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Every few minutes, she looked toward the operating room doors, as though determination alone might make them open. Their daughter remained nearby, refusing to remove the debate medal still hanging around her neck because her father had insisted that morning she wear it proudly all day. Neither of them knew how many battles were being fought beyond those closed doors. Back inside surgery, another complication emerged. Daniel's blood pressure rose suddenly, then fell again almost as quickly. Mercer examined every repaired vessel. Nothing explained the fluctuation. The anesthesiologist confirmed medication delivery remained accurate after repositioning the central line. The monitors showed no obvious equipment malfunction. Claire closed her eyes for the briefest instant, not to rest, to listen. The room continued moving around her, but she allowed herself one silent heartbeat, in which she ignored every conversation and every alarm, searching instead for the rhythm hidden beneath them all. Then she opened her eyes and looked toward the perfusion warmer. The temperature reading was drifting downward again, not dramatically, only enough to slow clotting and interfere with the patient's already fragile recovery. She crossed the room immediately, adjusted the malfunctioning connector, and verified the warming circuit by hand rather than trusting the digital display alone. Within moments, the patient's core temperature began rising back toward normal. Mercer noticed the improvement almost immediately. "You caught that before the monitor flagged it." Claire answered without looking up. "Machines report. People observe." The words settled over the room with quiet weight. No one spoke after that. They simply worked. As the operation continued, fragments of Claire's own past surfaced in her thoughts, not as distractions, but as reminders. Nearly 15 years earlier, she had stood in another operating room while a young father died during emergency surgery after a rare transfusion reaction went unrecognized until it was too late. She had been a younger nurse then, experienced enough to notice something wrong, but not confident enough to insist when senior physicians dismissed her concerns. She still remembered walking into the hospital chapel long after midnight, wondering whether silence could ever become a form of regret. That night had changed her forever. She never promised herself she would always be right. She promised only that she would never again confuse respect for authority with abandonment of responsibility. Mercer carefully completed the final vascular repair. Bleeding remained controlled. Specialized blood replacement continued working exactly as Claire had predicted. For the first time since the surgery began, the patient's heart maintained a consistent rhythm for nearly 5 uninterrupted minutes. No one announced it. They simply noticed together. Relief entered the room quietly, almost shyly, as though afraid to arrive too early. The resident finally allowed himself a slow breath. One of the younger nurses smiled behind her mask before quickly returning to her instruments. Even Mercer felt the crushing weight on his shoulders ease ever so slightly. He looked toward Claire across the table. There was no embarrassment left between them, only gratitude that words could not fully express. "I should have listened sooner," he said softly. Claire met his eyes for only a moment before returning to the monitors. "We listen now. That's what matters." Before anyone could absorb the significance of those words, the cardiac monitor suddenly produced a sharp sequence of warning tones unlike any they had heard during the operation. The rhythm remained strong, but another value plummeted with frightening speed. Oxygen saturation inside the bloodstream began falling despite perfect ventilation. The anesthesiologist checked every connection. Nothing had failed. Mercer immediately searched the surgical field again. Still no bleeding. Claire's eyes shifted from one monitor to another until they settled on a number few people had been watching anymore. Pulmonary artery pressure. It was climbing rapidly. She felt her heartbeat quicken as the realization formed. The trauma had hidden one final danger from the very beginning, a danger capable of destroying every victory they had earned over the past hour. She turned toward Mercer, her voice steady despite the urgency. "Doctor, I think we're looking at an embolism. And if she's right, they had only minutes left to stop death from claiming the patient one last time." The words settled over the operating room with the force of absolute clarity. "Doctor, I think we're looking at an embolism." No one questioned Claire Donovan this time. There was no hesitation, no glance exchanged across the room, no silent calculation of titles or authority. Dr. Adrian Mercer responded before the final syllable left her lips. "Prepare for pulmonary embolectomy. Increase support. Notify cardiac backup." His voice still carried the confidence expected of a lead surgeon, but now it held something that had been missing when the operation began. Trust. The anesthesiologist immediately adjusted ventilation while medication flowed through newly verified lines. The surgical resident positioned additional instruments without waiting for instructions twice. Every member of the team moved with remarkable precision, not because they had become less afraid, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced by unity. Daniel Brooks had survived the accident, survived catastrophic bleeding, survived an autoimmune reaction that nearly destroyed his own blood, and survived the discovery of a hidden fragment of metal. Yet his greatest challenge had arrived only after they believed they were winning. The clot had likely formed during the violent trauma itself, remaining silent until shifting into the pulmonary circulation. It was rare. It was devastating. And without immediate intervention, it would erase everything they had fought to preserve. Mercer extended his hand. Clamp. Claire placed the instrument into his palm before he finished speaking. Suction. Already there. Additional sutures. Ready. Their movements seemed almost choreographed, each anticipating the next without wasted motion. Hours earlier, every exchange between them had been burdened by hierarchy. Now they communicated through mutual confidence earned under impossible pressure. The room felt different, not quieter, for the monitors still filled every corner with electronic urgency, but steadier. Fear no longer dictated movement. Purpose did. Outside the operating room, The waiting area had settled into the strange stillness known only to hospitals. Daniel's wife had stopped checking the clock because time had become meaningless. Their daughter sat beside her, reading the same paragraph from her father's folded graduation letter over and over without realizing she had never turned the page. A hospital chaplain quietly approached, offering nothing more than a gentle presence. Sometimes words were unnecessary. Sometimes simply remaining beside someone was its own form of compassion. Back inside surgery, Mercer carefully exposed the affected vessel while Claire monitored every subtle change in the patient's condition. The clot revealed itself exactly where she suspected. Large enough to compromise circulation. Small enough that another few minutes might have hidden it forever. Mercer worked with extraordinary precision, but even extraordinary skill required perfect coordination from everyone around him. Claire noticed a slight tremor in one of the residents' hands. Exhaustion had begun overtaking adrenaline. Without drawing attention to him, she smoothly reassigned the more delicate task to another assistant while allowing the resident to continue contributing elsewhere. No embarrassment, no criticism, only quiet protection of both the patient and a young professional learning what true teamwork looked like. The clot was finally removed. For one endless moment, nothing changed. The monitors remained stubbornly unchanged, refusing to reward hours of relentless effort. Every face in the room remained fixed upon the screens. Then the pulmonary pressure began falling. Oxygen saturation climbed 1 point, then another. Blood pressure steadied without additional medication. The heartbeat settled into a strong, consistent rhythm that no longer struggled against itself. The anesthesiologist slowly lowered his shoulders after realizing he had been holding his breath. The resident blinked twice before quietly whispering, "We got him." No one celebrated yet. Experience had taught them that survival announced itself cautiously. Mercer completed the final repairs with deliberate patience, refusing to rush simply because hope had returned. Claire verified every count, every medication, every instrument, every laboratory result one final time. Only when the last dressing covered the incision and the monitors continued displaying stable readings did the reality finally begin settling over the room. Daniel Brooks was alive. The operating room remained silent for several seconds, but unlike the earlier silences born from fear, this one carried profound relief. It was the silence people share when they have witnessed something larger than themselves. Mercer removed his glove slowly and turned toward Claire. Every member of the surgical team instinctively paused. They understood that another important moment was unfolding. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "If you hadn't spoken again after I dismissed you, this patient wouldn't be leaving this room alive." Claire shook her head gently. "If I had stopped speaking because I was embarrassed, I would have shared responsibility for losing him." Neither of us gets through today alone. Mercer lowered his eyes for a brief moment before nodding. Later that afternoon, after Daniel had been transferred safely to intensive care, Mercer requested an unscheduled meeting with the hospital's surgical staff. Nurses, residents, anesthesiologists, technicians, and attending physicians filled the conference room expecting a routine clinical review. Instead, Mercer walked to the front without notes. He described every major decision from the operation with complete honesty. He explained how experience had made him confident, but confidence had quietly become certainty, and certainty had nearly blinded him to another professional's observations. Then, in front of everyone present, he acknowledged Claire Donovan by name. He explained that the operation succeeded not because the most senior person had all the answers, but because someone refused to let another human being become a casualty of pride. The room remained still before breaking into quiet applause that grew naturally rather than dramatically. Claire looked visibly uncomfortable with the attention, but she accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout the day. After the meeting, one of the newest nurses approached her privately. She admitted that she had almost ignored something unusual during a procedure the previous week because she assumed the surgeons already knew better. Claire smiled gently before answering. "Experience deserves respect. Silence does not. Ask your question. Make your observation. If you're wrong, someone will explain why. If you're right, someone may get another tomorrow." Weeks later, Daniel Brooks walked slowly through the rehabilitation wing with his wife beside him and his daughter, carrying the graduation letter that had never been delivered on schedule. He insisted on visiting the operating room staff before leaving the hospital. When he finally met Claire, he thanked her for saving his life. She smiled with characteristic humility and simply replied that many hands had carried him home. Yet everyone standing nearby understood that those hands might never have worked together had one quiet voice accepted humiliation instead of responsibility. Before Daniel left, Mercer stood beside Claire outside the intensive care unit. Morning sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, painting long reflections across the polished floor where countless footsteps had hurried past over the years. Mercer finally spoke the sentence that would remain with everyone who heard it. The strongest hands in any operating room are the ones willing to listen. Claire nodded, watching another emergency team rush toward the elevators as a new patient arrived needing strangers to become a family for a few critical hours. She adjusted her badge, washed her hands, and walked back toward another ordinary shift, because the truest heroes rarely know which ordinary day will ask them for extraordinary courage. And if this story reminded you that kindness, humility, and the courage to speak can change another person's life, share it with someone who still believes that quiet voices often carry the greatest strength.